Only 1 out of 100 companies in the US will ever break $10 million in revenue. Only 1 out of 100. And of those 1 out of 100, only 1 out of 15 will go on to break that $100 million barrier. We need a culture that says the company's success matters more than any individual department or pillar. And we've got to get rid of, when you see people defending turf or the other parts, those behaviors you've got to uproot. And if you have it, you need to have some adult conversations. If this is what you're wanting, first of all, I tell them selling a company is not all it's cracked up to be, right? They're wired to do something.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of The Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel, and this week I'm bringing back special guest, Kevin Bassett. Now, Kevin is a dear friend and also a very good business owner and entrepreneur in his own right. Kevin owns a very successful CPA firm, a mid-sized company in North Carolina. He's worked with many of the Maui community clients that we have, helping them with tax strategy and other CFO level types of things. More than that, though, Kevin is a business owner in his own right. He has a CPA firm. He's scaled other companies and sold them. He's built other companies. He's been an equity stakeholder in construction and other types of companies as well. He's just a really good business owner. And in this case, what we're talking about is something that's really near and dear to both his heart and mine, which is the scaling ride that happens as you hit the really hyperbolic part of that curve that goes up. We're talking about how do you break through the $100 million barrier. Now look, only 1 out of 100 companies in the US will ever break $10 million in revenue. Only 1 out of 100. And of those 1 out of 100, only 1 out of 15 will go on to break that $100 million barrier. Kevin and I are going to talk about what are the signs that you're in that issue. It might show up at the 30, 40, $50 million range. It might show up at the $100, $120 million revenue range. But somewhere in there, you're going to have issues from leadership to a leadership structure. And we're going to talk in here about how do you create better leaders? How do you have better leadership structure? How do you have a better plan to leverage and focus your company on what matters most? And how do you have better execution? These are the 4 things that Kevin and I go into depth for. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this week's episode of The Business Coach. Well, Kevin, welcome to The Business Coach. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you doing, David? Always fun to be here.
Yeah, so we just get to hang out and have a conversation here. And as we get going here today, I'm curious, what's something that's going on in your life right now in terms of this move from being a house full of girls to a house full of empty bedrooms where all your daughters are out of the house now? I mean, all of them.
Well, that's good. Yeah, the difference is we got to schedule or persuade them to spend time with us now that they're out. That's one. But the other is we got a lot of freedom to, like we're tight with folks back from school, and now that we're all empty nesters, someone can just throw a text out that, hey, such and such is going on, and we can meet up in some other part of the country with no notice, and that's kind of cool too. So, yeah, and then you're still a little bit of ways from that, aren't you?
Yeah, so Adam and Matthew, I've still got a year and a half before what chooses to happen with that, and about 5 years for Josh. It's interesting. People keep saying, oh, it's coming, and I see it, I go, no, hold it back, not yet.
No, the difference is you can make your kids still come on vacation, and we have to spend a lot of money to persuade them to come on vacation with us. So that's different.
Yeah, although I will tell you that, I do get complaints. How could you force me to go on this trip to Hawaii? How can you take me here away from my friends? That's kidnapping.
Yep, exactly.
Well, today, Kevin, as you know, you and I are going to be talking about how to blow through this $100 million barrier. And I'll just start us off for our viewer or listener with some simple stats. So conversation comes this way, out of the 33-ish million businesses in the United States, 95% of them will never break it through $1 million, which means only 5% ever make it to over $1 million in revenue. Of that 5% that go through $1 million in revenue, only 22% of those will ever make it, or roughly 1 in 5 will ever make it past $10 million in revenue. That's 1% of all companies getting past 10 million in revenue. And of that 1% that gets by 10 million, only 1 in 15 of those will ever break $100 million in that barrier. So today we're going to talk about what is that $100 million barrier. Kevin, you and I are going to give our best input about what you might see if you're dealing with that and how people get around that. And so I'll start by framing out what I observe with people with that. And I'll just frame out to the viewer listener, this might happen at your company when you're at 40 or $50 million in revenue. You might be dealing with these things when you're at 100 or 150 million in revenue, or even 200 million. The barrier is a little artificial. We chose the 1, the 10, the 100, and the $1 billion barriers in various work just because it's clean. But the challenges happen for different types of businesses at different stages. You know, a builder might have more revenue than other types of businesses, and they might start experiencing this at a different stage than someone else, but they still have the same thing. So here's what I noticed, Kevin. I noticed that when they get to this point, they have a fairly full leadership team, but they don't have enough strong leaders. And one of the things that costs them is they have people who are, I'll call more placeholders, that worked when they were at 15 or 25 million in revenue. But as they've grown to 70 or 80 or $100 million in revenue, these people they're just weak. They're not strong enough to handle that kind of growth barrier. Do you ever notice that with clients where they'll have somebody and they're like, it feels like they're constantly chasing after putting out fires. Like I'll hear this way, Kevin, where they'll say, I'm going from one meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting, and their staff feels like they're getting shoved from meeting to meeting because that's the only way the owner knows how to solve these problems. What they don't have is they don't have strong enough leaders that they can lean on the leader to solve these problems versus them thinking they have to kind of push it through meetings to direct what's going on. What do you think about
Yeah.
that? Hi, everybody. David here. And I wanted to step out of the podcast for a quick moment and tell you about an exciting new opportunity for you. For over a year and a half, my staff and I have been working on simplifying a toolkit for business owners. This toolkit I wanted to make available for you for free. It's called our Business Growth Toolkit. And I think it's the best thing we've done for at least a decade. It's the 6 most popular business growth tools we have. Each of those tools, which is a PDF that you can download, comes with a short 5 to 10 minute explanation video from me showing and training you exactly how to use those tools right away to start scaling your sales, improving your margins, increasing your profitability, and probably most importantly of all, making your business more of a joy to own. It's all there in the Business Growth Toolkit. It's available. Take a look for the link in the show notes, or just go to MauiMastermind.com. That's MauiMastermind.com. Click on the resources section, and you'll have free access to that right there. All right, with that said, let's jump back into this week's podcast episode.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The big difference at both these levels you mentioned are the leadership team. So I do find that you need to have a leadership team really to get on the other side of 10 million in most business models and implement a lot of the stuff that they'll learn through a coaching program like yours. So unlikely that an entrepreneur out of sheer willpower and rugged individualism is the term. Unlikely that they're going to get past 10 million in most business models without a leadership team. That said, those leaders that can take you on that journey between say 10 million and maybe 30 million are not going to be the leaders that get you past 100 million. And the difference is you're going to have to tend to get more C-level leaders in place that are not necessary to go, from past 10 million to say 30 million. And that is probably a true CFO. Like most companies under 30 million don't need a true CFO. You probably can go all the way to 50 million without one, but somewhere along there, you got to get a true CFO. And then you're also going to have some of the leaders that are more, and I put in quotes, corporate, not appropriate for a small entrepreneurial company, but are appropriate for the 100 million. And sometimes that corporate term is used negatively, right? For a smaller company, it is a negative term, but you do need more of that organization. And part of why you need an actual CFO is at that level, it's not just about buying stuff and selling for a dollar and creating income. But the most important skill is, as Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger always said, is allocation of capital, right? You're not even thinking about that when you're running a $5 million business, but 100 million, it's the entire game. right? How you're allocating capital to scale.
As you say that, it's interesting to me. So what I notice is, and you brought up the first one, I put it down into four kind of categories as we talk through, better leaders, better leadership structure, better plan, and better execution. So let's stay with the better leaders for a moment. I notice there's this, it's well-intentioned where I have clients who will say, look, this person's been with me for 16 years. And I'd say to them, I say, look, I'm not saying you should let them go, but just because they have tenure doesn't mean they have the capability to go to that next piece. They're successful in a role, but you have to ask the role that you need for the company today, are they really the person you would hire if you were hiring from scratch? And usually the way I go about that is I'll say, look at the role to be done, the job to be done. If you were to define what are the 4 or 5 non-negotiable must-haves and who you would hire today if you were hiring fresh, nail those down. And let's grade your current person on a scale of 1 to 5 on each of these must-haves. And if they're 4s and 5s in all of them, wonderful. They probably can make the leap. But if they're 2s and 3s with maybe 1 4 or 1 5, you're not going to have the luxury of time. I mean, one of the things that stops $100 million company or a $80 million company from going to 160 million is the fact that you're now on the radar. You have competitors who see what you're doing. And so
Hmm.
you have to, at this point, scale faster. When you were 10 million growing to 20 million, no one cared if you did that in 1 year or if you did that in 7 years. But when you're at
That's right.
70 million going to 150 or to 200 or 300 million, your competitors look and say, hey, there's a profitable niche these people are doing. You're taking business from somebody. The bigger players are going to come back and try to come and take market share. So you're going to have to accomplish scale quickly, which usually means you're going to need some level of new outside leadership that's for what you need over the next 2 or 3 years of growth. Comments for you on that?
Yeah, no question. And so a couple of points there. One, yeah, the loyal folks that were with you from the beginning, they are important, and hopefully there is a home from in the organization, but they've got to be able to let go of their stuff. I have a funny example of a construction client that really was doing a good job of scaling and grabbing market share in multiple states. The funny thing in this fella, he had his mom in charge of the finances, and all she knew was QuickBooks. And they were well past 20 million. At that point, a construction company needs to move on to a stronger accounting package, not QuickBooks, and in this case, Sage. And she fought that whole thing tooth and nail because all she knew was QuickBooks. And the owner, great entrepreneur, but he didn't want to argue with his mom, who was his finance person. And that held them back for a number of years until finally they were able to come to an agreement and get a real controller, and as they continue to scale past 100 million and, an actual CFO running, but, you can imagine you can't do that on QuickBooks. And that's just one part of the company. But to your other point is, as you're scaling past 100, at that point, you probably have a number of different divisions or profit centers, and you're going to have to bring in actual division leaders to scale each of those on own, that kind of strong leadership to scale those to grow with any kind of growth rate, because growing, 50% at 100 million, that's a $50 million lift. And that takes a completely different way of doing things than when you were, $10 million just trying to add 5 million of revenue.
When I think about people that we need to hire or people we need to have to play a role, one of my favorite books, Kevin, I don't know if you've ever read this book, but it was called How Will You Measure Your Life, written by Clayton Christensen, who unfortunately has passed away at this point. But one of the sections, he had a section there, he talked about the job to be done, and he talked about schools of experiences. He was an entrepreneur who built a couple $100 million software enterprise, and then he left that for academics and went to teach at Harvard. And one of the things he talked in there, and as a hiring mistake, is a lot of times people hire someone they feel is impressive, but they're the wrong person for what they need today. And he had this category of schools of experiences. And his comment was, I can hire someone to be my operations leader, my COO, to run the whole day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter company. But if they're used to working in a $10 billion company, and they've helped a $10 billion company get to 100 billion, that person has really good skills, but they may not be relevant to helping a $50 million company get to $150 million companies. There's a different infrastructure, there's a different need. So he says, does the person you have the relevant schools of experience, have the relevant experiences to go from where you are today to where you plan to be? And I usually will tell my clients that at this point, you're a 50, 60, $70 million a year company and you're looking at the hires, you're looking, does this person have what you need over the next 2, 3 years, maybe 5 years? You're not looking 10, 20 years down the road. You need the person who's going to help in the intermediate space over 2 to 5 years, help you make that leap. So if you're a company and you're looking for that leader, if they've helped somebody at the 70 million get to the the $500 million level, probably have the relevant schools of experiences. But if they've only worked in large companies, or the opposite, if they've only worked with small companies doing at 5 million to 25 million in growth, it's the wrong person. And I think that's a big lesson that I would share.
Yeah, in fact, you explained it really, really well. That's great the way you frame that. That's 100% right, and you see this at different parts of it. Along the journey, someone will bring in somebody that was at large corporate when when they're a 10, $20 million company, and it usually fails spectacularly. But you're exactly right. $100 million company, if you got someone that their experience level was too small, or too large, it's going to fail. It's got to be relevant. That's very well explained and 100% right.
Yeah, and what happens is that now you don't have strong enough leaders this part. You don't have enough leadership attention. And the way the business owner has learned to solve that is they want to go in and fix everything. And so they start to call meetings and more meetings and more meetings because they feel like in the meeting, they get the information there, they can give their input and solve it there, and then they're on right to the next meeting. And in theory, that sounds wonderful, but back to back to back to back to back meetings, what that means is that there's really not much follow through on any of those parts. And the follow through can't be owner driven. It's got to
Yep.
be structure driven, which brings us as the first of the four is we need better leaders to break through this barrier. Now we need better leadership structure. And with better leaders by themselves aren't enough. How do the leaders connect with each other? And I'll share, I notice that for a lot of clients who are at the 50, $60 million level where they're very owner driven, they've got some good leaders. And they say things like, everyone says they understand the vision and the strategies. But when I ask, do they behave the vision and behave the strategies? I get this kind of like, well, not really. Or they feel like the different departments don't really communicate really well with each other. They tend to that's why the leader calls all these meetings. They force it to go through the meeting and the leader and come out back to the center and then back out. And that's a really inefficient, ineffective way because it makes the leader's own leadership attention, it's the bottleneck from that part.
Yep.
So how do we find a structure wherein the different departments, or we call them pillars, know what each other are doing, and how does what they're doing align with the company priorities? Otherwise, we get these pillars that are silos and fiefdoms, not really coordinated infrastructure. Comments from you on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, at when you're blowing through 100 million, at this point, you do have departments, right? Where at 10 million, those walls don't need to be as, aren't as strong. And you do that. And that brings the, what's often referenced to as your company's operating system. And you often refer to it that way. And that is really important. And on a day-to-day basis, probably more important than the strategy or the vision as far as the day-to-day ability to get things done, and having that operating system working where it's not everything running through the owner, because you simply can't be, right? At that point, you're either at a CEO level or maybe more of a board of director level, and the leadership has to happen further down, and your operating system needs to be working 100%.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I'll call this leadership structure, and it's the strategic structure of how we plan, prioritize, decide where to put energy, where not. Where should our time, talent, attention, and money go? Where should it not go? And then there's also then the strategic execution, which we'll get to next, right? We said better leaders, better leadership structure. And then we also said we're going to go from there and talk about it's important, better plan, better execution. So now on the leadership structure, I'm going to stay with this as just what is the way that you're different? Well, starting off with your C-level suite of folks, your chief marketing officer, your chief sales officer, your chief operating officer, your chief financial officer, your C-suite. How do they get clear on what the company plan is and what their plan that supports the company plan is? We'll get to that in a moment, some of that. But what I find is that when you don't have people who are used to being in a structure like that, they get very isolated and start seeing the business only through their eyes. The chief salesperson says, well, I see my stuff and I see everybody else as bit players helping me do what I need to accomplish in sales, or that's at best, or at worst, I see them as impediments, obstacles, or even the villains working against me. Those darn, people in production, those darn people in marketing, if only they would pull their weight. And you start seeing these cross purposes start to have frictions or drag on each other. The best companies that we coach that do this, their leaders are all on the same page. They know that from the company down, here's what our strategy is and the priorities are this year, this quarter. And then they know what they need to do to support that. But importantly, they know two levels. They know the company priorities, but they also know their own, but they know their other peers, what their priorities are and how their priorities every quarter relate to the company priorities, so that when there's a resource conflict, and there's always going to be resource conflicts, sales is going to say, we need to do this. And market is going to say, no, we need to do this. There's conflicts there. And when that happens, you need a structure for how to resolve that. And you need a culture where your leaders have good, effective working relationships with each other, so they go colleague to solve versus directly back through the owner, who usually plays that CEO role probably too long in many cases. Comments from you about that, Kevin?
In some case, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is exactly where strategy comes in, and the conflict you talk about is the most common, where sales and production and perhaps finance are gonna have possibly competing priorities, and they got to get on the same page, particularly sales, right? Yeah, it is an example. There's a longtime client, and I'm actually a board member on it, and they're going through that now. They're in an industry where margins are getting tighter, and they're dealing with tariffs and different things and whatnot. And so their resources are tighter. What they've done to help mitigate that with their operating system is they have an executive team that is on a company chat thing, and they're meeting a bit more often because of what they're going through at the moment. Quick half-hour meetings, checking in more often to make sure they are all aligned, because they've got competing interests at the moment, and they all have to be on the same page. Fortunately, since they started doing that, this half-hour weekly check-ins of the executive team and company chat during the week, in the interim, it's actually working really well, right? Because it's kind of all hands on deck, and fortunately, they're responding positively.
For us, the structure we'll usually use with a client is, we'll start with once a year, we're going to step away from the business to plan the coming year. And having my C-suite, my executives be part of that is useful. They're learning the business from other departments' frame of reference, other pillars' frame of references. They're getting a better working relationship. They have a voice in what's going on. But we believe in this idea of a 90-day sprint. Every 90 days, we have another one-page plan, and we have our company plan. And then we make sure that the pillar plans for sales and for marketing and for operations, and for us, our production is coaching, because our main service offering is a business coaching service. All of their plans feed up and support what's the company plan, what's the company priorities, which serve the strategy of the company. And what's I've found is, if I can know what the other people's priorities are, their plans are, with their clear criteria of success of what they're trying to accomplish in 90 days, now, when I do that, I can more ably understand how my piece fits into the bigger picture. And I also know how I can support other people. Part of the conversation is, hey, what do we need from each other so that we can be successful in helping the company reach its goals? And those types of conversations, we need a culture that says the company's success matters more than any individual department or pillar. And we've got to get rid of, when you see people defending turf or the other parts, those behaviors you've got to uproot. And if you have it, you need to have some adult conversations as a leader. Hey, at Acme Inc., we don't believe in turf wars. So if this person needs support and their priority is higher up on the company's priorities, then you move heaven and earth to support them, to support the company priorities. That's what we do here.
Yep, that's a great call. Yep, absolutely.
When I think about leadership structure from there, we tend to do a rhythm. I'm curious what some of your larger clients do. We do a rhythm wherein, that quarterly planning, we'll step out, review the quarter, plan the next quarter based on our annual goals and plan. But we found that every 2 weeks for our leadership team getting together, usually it's an hour and a half every 2 weeks, works about right. And we find that part of that's updating, so there's accountability on the big pieces. Part of that's going back to what are the big priorities that need to be organized across areas of the business, which often are. And we use that leadership meeting not just to update each other, but really to make sure that there's accountability on the big stuff. And then once a month, each of our leaders shares and updates how they're doing and tracking against their action plan so that people know. And then at the end of the quarter, we repeat that. And we found that regular quarterly process, that's, while not a perfect rhythm, is a really strong one to help. And we've used it with clients to go from 50 to 100, from 100 to 200 million in revenues. And we've seen that that's been effective. Where they start to struggle is they get so busy, they think, I don't have enough time, and they start stopping doing those things that were working before in terms of communication and coordination between different departments to align everybody on the same page.
Yep, got it. Yep, what I commonly say, I'd say most common I see with our larger clients are annual retreat, quarterly board meetings, monthly executive team meetings, weekly department meetings. That said, that one large client that I was just talking about earlier, they're, because of a special situation what they're going through, they're doing a weekly half-hour executive team because it's a unique situation, and so otherwise it wouldn't be that common.
Yeah, yeah. I would put out there that a sign that you don't have alignment is if you notice one of two things being true. If you notice that there is some tensions amongst teams where it seems like there's at odds or they're not really coordinated in that, there's probably some alignment issues. And then number two, when you're finding yourself, putting out fires again and again and driven by meetings or these urgencies of these quick huddles with things, chances are a lot of that comes from that you've lost the idea of a 90-day sprint to actually not just put out a fire, but to get into how do we scalably prevent the fire from happening in the future, which usually requires a little bit of a longer period of attention. And we can solve something in a day, in a week, in a month, but are we really going to prevent that from ever happening? Usually it's going to take a couple of quarters to solve, fix, and to stay with it long enough to start to operationalize it. And it might take us another 1 or 2 years to make that operationalized, fixed, become part of the automatic culture inside of our company, so that the thing that we fixed, that we've operationalized that operationalized fix now becomes the automatic default in the company.
Yep, that's great. Great idea.
Hey, I'm curious for you. So if we go from there, we go from better leaders, better leadership structure to the better plan. This is an interesting one. I notice that a lot of companies, what they find as they scale is they lose sight and they start trying too many different things, serving too many different markets with too many different products and services, with too many different sales channels, too much complexity. They start adding complexity back in the mix versus narrowing what they do so that they can more profitably scale by increasing revenues faster than expenses increase. If revenues are going up by 30%, but expenses are only going up by 12, that's going to have a really good compounded impact. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no question. As I look at we can see this on $100 million companies and billion-dollar companies publicly traded. Absolutely, the more that you can focus, the more profitable you are, and the easier it is to scale. A lot of folks are familiar, say, with Apple, and a lot of times they don't realize is how much courage it took to cannibalize and stop making certain products, right? iPods no longer exist. The iTunes store no longer exists. These are things that scaled up and made money for them for a while, but then were killed off. Well, the same is true in some of these other ones. And I've got one client was pretty wild. It was a decent sized full exteriors company, and their main line was roofing. But they discovered that, for example, windows are by far the highest margin trade. They killed off the roofing division that had been there, what kind of what got the company started. And they were able to scale past, they're approaching $500 million of just windows now, right? They're just doing that well. And they have multiple geographic areas, but one trade now. And their margins are more than double what they were as roofing, and they've scaled far beyond what they would have, otherwise. And that took courage, right?
It sure did. And so it's interesting. They got scale by going with geographic spread.
Yep.
But if they tried that geographic spread with really complex, roofing plus windows plus maybe some other contracting
Siding,
types of
yep,
service
yep,
lines,
yep.
that's a really tough thing to keep quality and production efficiencies and pricing there and managing of gross profit margin. That's tough to do. By having some specialization, they
Yep.
probably became extraordinarily good at not just selling the jobs and marketing for that, but producing them profitably and managing the quality and
Yep.
those things they became. And so scaling geographically was not as hard as trying to scale by going to spreading the offering geography versus the
And
physical footprint of their business.
they did. And not only instead of just going wide, they went very deep. So even without the geographic spread, the amount of market share in each market that they got was unbelievable. They're far and away the leader in the markets now with, and they far more market share than they had when they were multi-trade.
I think it's fantastic. It's interesting. So if we go from better leaders to better leadership structure to better strategy, part of strategy is focusing on what will you cut out. And one of my favorite management theorists, the late Peter Drucker, we've even named one of our tools, the Drucker hierarchy against them. What are the things that we're going to just stop doing? What are the things we're going to phase out of? What are the things we're going to coast on? So that and what are the things we're going to avoid altogether so that we have extra energy to grow some things and some things we're going to actually scale. We're growing, I mean, organically growing, putting more resources that we have to what's working. And scaling might be doing things like buying a competitor that has to grow by that way, or bringing in a part of a new business that we bought part of their business because we wanted their customer list, or it's basically growth on steroids. We're putting a lot more money resources to get a magnitude faster growth than just growing organically 10, 15, 30%, 40% compounded. How do we double, triple, quadruple per year by putting more resource? So I love that idea. So I'm curious, how do you work with a client to help them realize what they need to stop or phase out or move away from or diversify away from so they can free up those resources to put to what's better? Your roofing company was a great example. They
Yeah,
probably didn't just stop doing roofing because they needed the revenue and they couldn't just stop. They probably diversified away, grew the windows to the point where it no longer made sense to keep the roofing, and they probably sold off the roofing and divested of, is my guess. Yes?
Yeah, they did courageously stop, but you're right. It wasn't until they were, making great money on roofs and were able to shift resources. I don't even remember if they had headcount reduction when they made the move. Maybe they did, but I just remember the good part, right? But they courageously did,
Right, but
and
they courageously did that once Windows hit a certain volume. They
yeah,
didn't go from 1 million in Windows, 50 million in roofs to say we're getting rid of the
right.
$50 million and going all in on roofs. I don't think so.
Yeah, no, they did. They'd gotten some scale on Windows, and it proved itself out, right? It was a proof of concept. That said, in our CFO program, we have a very simple one-page tool called Profit Finder, where we're doing exactly that. What do we need to double down on and scale? What do we need to optimize? And then finally, what do we need to cut? And I think it was also Jim, in addition to Peter Drucker, I think Jim Collins, he famously had part of one of his books about the stop doing list is even in his talk about budgeting, there's certain things that should not be funded at all, right? You completely cut them out. And sometimes that is the most important thing a leader does.
It's interesting you say that with Collins, his hedgehog principle from good to great. But what I find for business owners at 10, 20, 30, 40 million, they say, well, David, I'm not spending money on other stuff. I say, well, hang on a second here.
Hmm.
You've got all these other initiatives going on. These initiatives have staff. Staff get paid what? Oh, they get paid money. You are putting money in these other places.
Yep.
And I don't mind you. I think you mentioned Apple earlier. I mean, the the thing that stops people from breaking the $1 billion barrier over time, one of them is they have a great economic engine, and that economic engine starts sputtering. So we do need to think what's going to be next and what's going to be next and what's going to be
Hmm.
next. But we can't put 50% of our resources into what's next unless we know that the current workhorse engine is about to die. And then it's survival mode. But in most
Yep.
cases, we do need to have some percentage, 5, 10, 15% playing with what's coming down the road so that we can pick the winning one or two, kill off the others, take the best from the things we've killed off and incorporate what makes sense. And Apple and other companies have done a great job with that, right? iTunes was incorporated a lot of those lessons into the App Store
Yep.
and with how they sold their cloud services. And, the iPod, all of that fit into their phone. So it wasn't, they recognized that just a music player by itself, which was revolutionary along with the iTunes Store, phones were going to go past that, right? That was the killer application for them.
Yep.
And so I like that idea of it. So this idea, you said, what are the places we need to scale? What are the places we need to optimize? And I think the third one you said, what are the places we need to cut? Were those
Yep.
your three you had said?
Yep. That's exactly right.
Great questions. I love them.
Yep.
Give me an example of a business who asked the question, what do we need to scale? What do we need to optimize? What do we need to cut? Give me an example of that, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we take that contractor one that, scale windows and then completely cut roofing, right? That was key.
What were
And
they
then
optimizing?
like Optimize was their repair division, which is smaller service stuff. And then yeah, and I think all the way back to MBA programs, right? They had the concept of rising star, cash cow, and dogs, right? And I still remember the professor teaching that one, right? And you kill off the dogs and sell off. And we've also had other companies, particularly some of the big ones, where they have kind of these orphan divisions that they just sell off to somebody, and that's a great new business for somebody else, just not large enough to move the needle for them and then optimize. But you always got to be looking, what's your cash cow now? That's your money, your economic engine today, but your rising star is the one tomorrow. And many experts argue, and I tend to believe things are moving faster now, right? So you gotta be a bit perhaps a bit more alert than the old days, how quickly things can change,
Hmm.
and and make those kind of pivots.
That's
And
right. A
it does
cash
take
cow
courage.
today might not have a 20-year horizon. It
That's
might
right.
have a 4-year or 3-year horizon before some new technology or some new competitor comes in and reinvents the category or invents a
Completely
new
change it.
category
Yeah,
that's better.
and Blockbuster, right? By Netflix. That went pretty quickly in hindsight. And then, yeah, and I don't know the answer. How long was iTunes around? I don't think it was 20 years. It was probably less than 10, maybe. And it moves fast. Yep.
Yeah, I know for our business, when we started up, we were just doing workshops. This is after I sold another business. And so workshops were our cash cow. And I loved doing them. But what I really realized was once I had kids, that was a pretty big lifestyle cost. When I didn't have kids, it was fun and exciting. And rather than keeping workshops as a big profit line for us, we incorporated it or absorbed it into our coaching program, right? So we still do fairly large events throughout the year, quarterly at least, but the events are primarily driven 80, 85, 90% for coaching clients and their key staff. Yes, we'll bring some outside people who will pay retail for the workshop, but more of it we've kind of incorporated. And I think you'll see that a lot with a cash cow that's getting disrupted. You take the best of that and you're probably going to put it into some new piece in some other way. You'll recycle some of the value that you have. But I
Yeah,
want to come,
absolutely right. And that's not even counting other changes like COVID. You had to pivot there and suddenly deliver more online than you had to before out of pure necessity.
that's right.
Yep.
One more thing that stops a business, this $100 million barrier. And again, just to be clear, the $100 million barrier is magical, but it really could happen at 40 or 50 million on the low end, and it can happen at 150 or 200 million at the upper end. These are things that it's more of a zone than a specific point in time. It's not at 99 million we're great, at 100 million it all falls to pot. It's
That's
somewhere
right.
in that zone with that. But Kevin, I noticed that what happens is a lot of companies will scale. They'll get to 20, 30, 40, 50 million. They'll start having the front end of the sound barrier zone
Yep.
and things start shaking a little bit more and their teeth are rattling. And then the owner says, screw it, I'm just going to sell and retire and enjoy my life a little bit differently. And so I often will tell clients, if this is what you're wanting, first of all, I tell them selling a company is not all it's cracked up to be, right?
Mhm.
They're wired to do something. They're not going to sit on a beach for any length of time, and their spouse certainly isn't going to want them that much in their day-to-day messing with their schedule and what they do. But what I notice is that if I can help them connect back to their mission and focus on contribution and really make the business something that their role is one that they love, that often they're wanting to hold on to it for 5 or 10 more years than they would have otherwise. And those 5 or 10 more years of compounding was really the secret ingredient to go from 60 million to 140 million. They just needed more time with them involved. And to do that, they needed to mature their role and their relationship to their business at the same time they matured the relationship. What are your thoughts
Uh,
about that?
yeah, absolutely right. A number of points, and I feel very strongly on. You're exactly right. The game does change, and entrepreneurs have to make a decision on are they going to continue to level up and continue to be, let's call it CEO of that organization as you go, say, from 50 to 100, or do they step into more of a chairman role and have bring in someone else to do that? And there's an author and business consultant named Randy Nelson, and he writes these books, First Decision, Second Decision, so on. And he says that's one of the decisions. I think it's the second decision. First decision is become an entrepreneur. The second one is to, whether to remain on and level up and take your organization next level, or to hand it off. And for example, I enjoy being an operator and leader of my firm, so it's thus far I'm choosing to continue to level up, and that's a decision I'm making. And then the decision to get out, to sell before you're ready is actually in many cases a tragic decision that folks make. And I was just funny, my wife and I were just talking about this. She was reading on Kendra Scott, who I think at this time, I think she's like 50 or something like that, or maybe late 40s. And she's been looking at this a lot, and she's choosing to stay on. And she looks at a bunch of her mentors and someone she respected in Kate Spade. Kate Spade uh, really regretted her decision to sell and eventually tragically took her own life. She was missing that company. So, but entrepreneurs selling before they're ready can lead to a lot of bad things, right? Depression, the 3 Ds they say, depression, divorce, and in some cases death. And another tragic mistake is if they sell before it's walkaway money. Now you got to work for somebody else. Well, that's pretty lousy. But on the other hand, many cases just a matter of leveling up or handing off the organization and stepping into a chairman role. Change, as you said, changing their relationship with the company. Yep.
So I guess I'll sum that part up is I've got to mature my role in the company. I've got to mature my relationship to the business. At the same time, I mature the business, better leaders, better leadership structure, better strategy, better strategic execution. And those have to happen. It doesn't have to be perfectly in tune, but in rough alignment so that when the business gets to a certain stage, I as an owner have matured myself along the way so I can have more options available. And those options now could include another 5, 10, 15, or 20 more years with the business. And my sense is that most business owners who have grown themselves along the way, they really do have extraordinary value to offer their business that an outside party is less likely to have because they've been there and they brought something with it. Now, if they haven't grown themselves, often they're the anchor holding it back. But those that sustainably thrive through the $100 million barrier, often, not always, but often the owner still plays a really big role, but they've grown themselves along the way so that their role was healthy for them and healthy for the business at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. And some choose to, mature with their business indefinitely. Warren Buffett, up through his 90s, and Sam Zell, scaled his organization huge and was doing deals and speaking at events up to 3 weeks before his passing at age 81. And the great thing about being an entrepreneur, it's a choice. Which is really great. Choices others don't have.
I think it's a perfect point to stop on with that, Kevin. I really appreciate it. It's a choice that others don't have, so it's a privilege. We got to be grateful for it, and to
Mm-hmm.
recognize that we have to continue to earn it. by growing ourselves and growing our companies at the same time.
Absolutely.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on the Business Coach today. I wish you every success, and it's fun to have you periodically come back to the podcast. I think you have a lot of wisdom to share. One of the things that's interesting is when you get to be involved with the companies that you're either on the boards with or you're actively scaling, or in more cases, that you're playing the role of essentially an outside CFO for them in your CFO side or even on your tax practice. You have a lot of insight that the average person wouldn't have. So it's fun when you get to share your experiences with the community. And I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have the best job in the world. I love it. So thanks. Yep.
All right. Have a great rest of your day,
You
Kevin.
too. Thanks for having me. See you.